Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Carberry, CEO of Explore Mars, and welcome to the H2M seminar series called Feeding Mars, looking at how we might feed future astronauts and settlers on Mars and elsewhere in the future. Before I introduce our panelists for today, just a few short announcements. First off, next week we'll be conducting a webinar at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday, June 25th, called Designing Mars. This panel will be looking at how we design living spaces, how designing living spaces should be approached to maximize productivity, crew health, and happiness. This session will be moderated by Beth Munn from Casual Space and feature Michael Zizzo, an architect, and Vera Miliani from Mars City Design. Since this webinar series is leading up to the Humans to Mars Summit, we'd like to thank all of our Humans to Mars Summit sponsors, including Aerojet Rocketdyne, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, ULA, Paragon, MDA, the National Institute of Aerospace, the AAS, the Science and Entertainment Exchange, Two Planet Species, and many other partners as well. So thank you very much for your support. And on that topic, if you enjoy these webinars, we hope you'll help support. I know all of you were generous enough to make a donation to come on, but if you like these programs, they are not inexpensive, so we'd appreciate any help that you can provide. Or if you're interested in sponsorship, please reach out to us at info@ExploreMars.org. And now it's time to move on to our webinar, Conversation Feeding Mars. Moderating today is Dr. Graham Lau, known as the Cosmobiologist. He's Director of Communications for Blue Marble Space, as well as Research Scientist for Blue Marble Space. So Graham, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for joining in. I am an astrobiologist. I spend a lot of my time thinking about geochemical signatures of life that we find in various places on Earth and that we might find in space, about exoplanets and telescopes and missions and instruments and things like that. But I'm also very interested in our human future in space, including how we're going to feed ourselves, not only on the International Space Station and maybe hopefully upcoming missions to the moon, but also on Mars and beyond. So today's panel should be pretty exciting. I'm not an expert in this field, but I'm so excited to talk to experts in this field. So today we're going to have on Dr. Sian Proctor, who's a geoscientist and analog astronaut. We'll have on Morgan Irons, the founder and chief scientist with Deep Space Ecology. Mike Selden is joining us. He's the CEO of Finless Foods, which is more to come there. And also Dr. Rafael Loureiro, professor of botany at the Winston Salem State University in North Carolina. So this should be a lot of fun. I'm going to introduce each panelist separately, and then I have a few questions for them. But along the way, if any of you have questions, please remember to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions for each panelist specifically as we talk about things here today. I think first off, I want to talk to Sian Proctor. So Dr. Sian Proctor is a geoscientist, explorer, and a specialist in science communication with a passion for space exploration. She's been an analog astronaut, completing 4 analog missions so far, including the all-female Sensoria Mars 2020 mission at the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation Habitat, also known as High Seas. Also in 2013, she was part of the NASA-funded 4-month Mars mission at High Seas, and 4 months in isolation of the Mars analog sounds pretty cool. She's also lived at the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah and at the Lunares habitat. She believes that when we solve for space, we can also solve issues on Earth. And she believes that sustainable food practices used in space exploration can reduce food waste here on Earth now. So Sian, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I did 1 analog mission once. I absolutely loved it. 4 sounds incredible, including 4 months. That's awesome. And so I want to start off, you spend a lot of time in these Mars simulations at analog sites, living with a small group of people, even for up to 4 months. So when you created the cookbook, Meals for Mars, and how we're going to design meals for the future of Mars. Right there it is. So I'm wondering if you could share with us, kind of your viewpoint on our primary challenges in preparing food for Mars in making meals on Mars in this limited resource environment? And from your experience in an analog simulation, what are the major challenges for us in the future?
Yes, and one of the things that I want to talk about is what happened during my 4-month Mars simulation. It was specifically funded by NASA to investigate food strategies for long duration spaceflight. And actually, Wade, I think we will use the slide. So if you could bring up the second slide that shows the high seas habitat for those that are not familiar with it. The high seas habitat was established in 2013, and backing for that came through NASA. There was 2 principal investigators, one out of Hawaii, that is Dr. Kim Benstead, and the other one is out of Cornell University, Dr. Gene Hunter, and they got money from NASA specifically to investigate food strategies for long duration spaceflight. And so when we think about this, what does that mean? Why is NASA interested in food strategies for long duration spaceflight? Well, this image here tells you why. The astronauts up in the ISS, there are a lot of things that happen when it comes to food preservation, nutrition, and not suffering from menu fatigue. Now, menu fatigue, if you haven't heard that before, it's when you get bored of eating the same material or the same meals, or your fluids in your body change because of being in the reduced gravity environment. So the food that you love doesn't taste the same. So even though you've picked out all of these meals while you're on the ISS, when you get up to space, you find out that, they're not quite the same. And so that leads to issues with not wanting to eat, which has an impact on health and nutrition. But the biggest one for me is the culture of food. And so if you go to the next slide, the next slide is going to just show you what the high seas habitat looks like. It's on the big island of Hawaii, and 6 people, so me and 5 other individuals, lived in this 900 square foot dome for 4 months investigating food strategies. So if you go to the next slide, the thing about it, when we think about going to Mars, a lot of times people are like, okay, we're going to grow food on Mars and we're going to be able to feed ourselves. Well, that's not going to happen right away. We basically are going to have to supply our Martian astronauts or our moon astronauts with shelf-stable ingredients until we can figure out how to be self-sustained. And so in this 4-month study, we couldn't grow any of our own food. We only could use shelf-stable ingredients. And since we were the first crew to live in this habitat, you can see all of the food and the variety of food that we had to make up our space pantry. And if you go to the next slide. And so for our food study, the most interesting thing is that imagine 4 months where 2 days you eat like astronauts eat right now, which is just add water and heat meals. So that's the chicken a la king on the left. And so that's where you just boil water, you scoop some in, and it cooks, everything self-contained, versus 2 days of being able to creatively cook using freeze-dried fruits, meats, and vegetables. And so we alternated 2 days of just add water and heat meals, and then 2 days of creatively cooking for 4 months. And that's what NASA was interested in. And so if you go to the next slide, the big takeaways from this really for me, and why I did the Meals for Mars cookbook and thinking about solving for Earth and solving for space, is that the culture around food is extremely important. So it's not just enough to grow food and expect people to be able to survive and thrive on that food. There's a whole culture that comes with those astronauts. And if we don't take that into consideration, then we won't be successful at feeding them. And we can go into more detail about what that means. But then also the community of eating together, creativity that comes with cooking, and then how do you build cohesion with a group when you're so far away from home? And so those are some of the things that I learned from living in these Moon and Mars simulations over the last 8 years.
Yeah, it seems so so crucial to understand the impacts to our culture and to how we share together in this process of growing and raising food, of cooking our food, of sharing meals together. I wonder if you could, just for a moment. I mean, we are in this global pandemic right now. I wonder how physical isolation during a pandemic or, during a trip to Mars, for instance, how you see that really affecting people, and maybe you can, relate that to the importance of our food.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things. Me personally, I have what I call the COVID-5. I gained 5 pounds because one of the things that happens is the stress of being in this type of environment that we're in right now. So what do? We typically will go to comfort foods and drinks. And so I found myself snacking a lot more on salty things and chocolates and just things that I normally didn't have or indulge in quite as much. So thinking about my food habits and how they have changed as a result of just being stressed a little bit. And what's different about being in this environment versus going in the Mars simulation is I knew when the Mars simulation was going to end. It was 4 months, but I knew the end date. Mm-hmm. With COVID, we're all like, oh, is there another like swell? And so there's this underlying tension. And you can imagine going to Mars that there's always going to be somewhat of a tension of, am I going to ever go back and see Earth again? We're in a hostile environment. So you're always slightly very mindful that you can be killed at any minute, or all of you could be wiped out at any minute. And so thinking about those kinds of things is very analogous to, kind of how we're dealing with isolation. And then ways of combating that through creativity. And food is one of the most greatest ways for us to be creative.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know my wife and I love cooking together. It's kind of a fun practice, and we have an 11-month-old son. And so, the process of cooking food for him is also, a big enjoyment right now for us. You also have a live stream show right now on your Facebook channel for space snacks, where you've been talking to folks about, food and space and their interest in space exploration and also food. Has anything really come across so far as like really exciting or kind of, surprising about, people's relationship to food and space?
Well, the big thing is that it comes back again and again to comfort food. And so when we think about what would we want to eat on the moon or Mars, it's about, most people are like, well, I want to eat pizza because it's my favorite food, or, oh, I can't live without chocolate. And so these are the little things that if we don't take that into consideration, then you can imagine being in the Matrix where the one guy who is the evil guy, he just wanted to be plugged in again so he could have a steak and not have to eat that goo that was being provided. And so we really have to consider how, and especially when you talk about diversity and inclusion and different cultures. And so how do we accommodate everybody when it comes to sophisticated palates and food when we're so far from home on Mars?
Yeah, it's a great point. And actually there's something in your biography that kind of caught me, and I wonder if you could just talk to this for one moment. Your biography says that you believe that when we solve for space, we also solve issues on Earth. And we certainly have a lot of issues on Earth right now. And it's very profound. I wonder if you could expound for just a moment on that idea.
Yeah, you know what? My good friend Mike Mongo is the one who kind of coined me onto that term. And the idea is that space is hostile. If Mars is extremely hostile. And so the whole idea of living there, we have to be super efficient with our food, our water, our energy, how we design our shelter, how we protect ourselves from radiation. All of those things that we need to survive on Mars are the things that we need to thrive here on Earth. And so as we build that technology to become efficient in water and in food and not wasting food and all of those systems, all that technology comes back to Earth. And ideally, we implement it here to make us more sustainable. And then as we innovate and make changes here, we send that back to space. And so it's really a circular kind of thing where it makes us not only the Earth more survivable and humanity more survivable here, but also on Mars makes us successful in that endeavor.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's important these technologies we're developing for our blue marble here. I'd love to bring Rafael Loureiro in now. So Rafael is a plant physiologist and professor of botany at Winston-Salem State University. His work is focused specifically in analyses of plant ecophysiological responses applied to human space exploration horticulture in both lunar and Martian regolith and in worldwide food security challenges as well. And so, Rafael, thank you for joining us, first off.
It's great to be here. It's a great break from all the madness.
Yeah, no kidding. So I've heard you say before, you are an astrobotanist. I wonder if you could, just for the audience, kind of explain what is astrobotany? What does that field entail right now?
I think that astrobotany is a very, very wide term that we can put when we work with plants in space. I think that it can be applied for people who work with physiological responsible plants in low gravity, people who work with the growth of plants in either Martian lunar regolith, or people who are trying to figure out if we happen to have some sort of life that is photosynthetic and resembles plants on the planet. So it's a pretty broad term, and I like it because it sounds cool, and it's something that we're trying to put out there as some sort of a new field that gathers people, especially botanists, around us. Unfortunately, botanists are a dying race because most people associate botany with just classifying plants. And especially at the university, some students are afraid of botany, and just trying to bring the space element to it helps them to be fascinated about things that they can actually do related to crops and related to space. So
that's awesome.
Pretty broad field, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a really large field. And I like the connection to astrobiology as well, being the kind of nerd that I am. But you've been working a lot, and I know this since you also are affiliated with Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. You've been working with growing crops in soil simulants of lunar and Martian regolith. Can you tell us a bit about the challenges of trying to grow crops in soil from the moon or Mars?
Yeah, so one of the things that we initially tried to do is that you have a lot of papers published about growing crops in lunar and Martian regolith, and most of them don't follow a standard protocol. People, they're researching this, they have their own protocols, they do their own things. There are certain flaws in their methodology in terms of not sterilizing the soil and not keeping the soil sterile. And it's not even can be qualified as soil because it's not alive, it's regolith. So we tried to initially have some sort of a protocol to evaluate the growth of those individuals in real Martian and lunar conditions. Also adding perchlorate to the soil in the quantities that we have based on rover measurements and everything else. So I would say that it was very challenging at the beginning, even though things will grow. And I talked to my research students that you can grow seeds out of a wet paper towel. You can germinate seeds. It can break dormancy of the seed. It can make them germinate out of a paper towel. The real problem is to sustain them. How can we properly sustain an individual that is going to be under constant stress? It's not what they're used to. They don't have microorganisms to help them out. So the challenges that we're facing is just trying to understand how the plant is interpreting those stresses and how can we cope with that? How can we help the plant mitigate those stresses by offering maybe a safe association of microorganisms to the rooting area of the plant, or maybe trying to figure out some nutrients that are cheap to transport and cheap to administrate in the individuals. So it's quite challenging, but at the same time, it's fun for us to have such a tremendous amount of things to do.
Yeah, it sounds like a challenge.
Yeah, work never ceases to exist. And it's something that really motivates us to, for instance, we recently participated in an event that we brought people some Martian regolith growth tomatoes, and those were not with the soil was obviously not perchlorated, so we didn't want to affect anyone with that. But the soil was completely sterile. We didn't have any microorganisms associated to it, and people were like, they taste weird, but it still feels like a tomato. So that's pretty much what we want to have as a response. We're not there yet in terms of all the nutrient contents and everything that we need, but we're definitely trying to make it at least a little bit better than it is.
Awesome. Yeah. Like Sian mentioned, with space exploration, our taste buds change a little bit when we're on the ISS or a space shuttle of some form. It'll be a little bit different on the moon and Mars, of course, obviously too. And so it's nice you can get some flavors that are at least a little bit close. So I actually, recently I saw you talking to one of our colleagues about the issues with trying to grow plants in specifically lunar dust, this really sharp, jagged, very fine particulate matter. You mentioned, the need for intense PPE to really work with actual lunar simulant. So can you explain that a little bit for everyone? But also, can you speak to how we're then going to mitigate that issue when we actually are growing crops on the moon or on Mars?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're concerned the most, especially when you involve students in research. We have to make them safe. Sometimes us researchers are like, oh, okay, I'll go ahead and do this. And sometimes we cannot do that, especially when it's putting our students' life in jeopardy. Especially in regards to lunar regolith, there are some types. And types, what I say is that we get those regoliths from a number of companies, especially University of Central Florida has a very reliable source for regolith. My huge shout out for the Exolith lab at UCF that provides us with most of the regoliths that we use for our research. Some of them, especially the Dusty Y, that is something that we have been trying to work with for quite some time now. The particles are extremely fine, and that can cause serious respiratory problems, to the point that we have to have a lab that is exclusively dedicated to lunar regolith work. The lab is isolated. We have to have a special vent in the lab so the students are safe, and the students have to wear hazmat suits and respirators and everything else to work with the particular regolith. So the challenges themselves in terms of germinating seeds, seeds will germinate, but they are not going to fixate themselves to the regolith itself. Most of the fact that there is a huge accumulation of water up top, there is a huge anoxic area that is created by just adding water to it. And when we try to extract the seed just to evaluate what hormones the seeds were producing and everything else, it's literally concrete. So we have to break the tube to take a look at the seed and see everything else. So it is complicated for you to work with certain types of lunar regolith. And in terms of overall results, we have been having some very promising results with some types of lunar regolith, but the others we know that 100% that are not going to grow anything. Seeds are going to germinate, but the plants are not going to grow. So at this point, we're trying to also standardize a protocol so we can make it available for everybody. And so everybody can use pretty much everything in the same pattern so we can accumulate more results. Because due to, space restrictions and everything else that we have in the lab, we cannot have like 50 crops running at the same time and evaluating individuals in their developmental stages throughout, from seed to seed that we call it. So seed individuals are going to, from seed, produce other seeds. So having this standard protocol and giving out to the scientific community so people can do some joint work and collaborating with us, it's very important. And this is what we're trying to do right now.
Nice, that's very awesome. So tell me, the Martian, Mark Watney, growing plants, and
he will be completely dead, 100% sure. I'm sorry, it's the truth. Martian soil has a tremendous concentration of perchlorate, almost like 0.6%. Last time it was measured was 0.5% of the overall composition of soil in certain locations. And also, depending on the location that he landed, concentrations of micronewtons and macronutrients are going to be different. So he could have landed in a completely arid zone without any nutrients whatsoever. That's why we work with several different types of Martian and lunar regolith, and try to make our own blends to see where the proper location will be for cultivation. Mm-hmm. But due to the perchlorate and direct exposure of the perchlorate, you can see him there kind of moving around the soil, just making the lines for him to plant the potatoes and everything else. This is sheer exposure of the soil without any protection whatsoever. We surely kill him. He would not be alive. I'm sorry.
Oh, man. Well, thanks for letting us all know and crushing us a little bit. But it's good to know, the real science behind it. Before we move on, I actually want to ask a question about advocacy. So you're really interested, involved in science advocacy. You have a passion for it. I wonder if you can kind of share with us how your work in botany and astrobotany relates to your passion for communicating science with other people, with sharing with students, and with advocating for science politically.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to not necessarily impose to my students, research students, but encourage them to do is to talk to decision makers. People out there legislating about the money that we're using for research. And just to, especially, I work at an HBCU and I work in an environment that some students don't feel appreciated. And the fact that they can directly contact their representatives there and say, hey, I'm doing this, and this is super cool, and I'm using your money to do this, the state money to do this, or federal money to do this, is something that I really think that should be encouraged. Because people tend to not treasure what they don't know. So by knowing what they're doing and knowing what these students are doing, and the science that were generated, they can really appreciate it. So that's why I encourage for us to, for instance, send monthly reports to congressmen and women and senators of what we're doing and what we're discovering and the applicabilities that those, biotechnologies that were generated can have here on Earth. Some of the projects that we have developed didn't fall through in terms of, applicability for space, but some of them for sure could have been used here on Earth, and we offer them alternatives, for instance, to offer that tech for small farmers, local small businesses, and everything else. So it's really important for us to show them what we were doing so they can treasure and not cut off funding. So.
Yeah, that's crucial for science and the future of science. For us to learn more is we need support, not just from legislators, but the public as well. And we need people to hear about it. And so it's great to be advocating and communicating your science.
Yeah, exactly. That's backing from the public is essential for our success.
Absolutely. I do want to go over to Morgan Irons now. Morgan Irons is the founder and the chief science officer of Deep Space Ecology Incorporated. It's a space agricultural business startup working to solve the challenges of food security on Earth and in deep space as we venture out into the solar system. Her work is concentrated on quasi-closed agroecological systems for sustainability in extreme environments and in long-duration space habitation. Morgan is also a soil and crop sciences PhD student currently in the Lehman Lab at Cornell University, where her research is focused on microbial and organomineral stabilization mechanisms in soil aggregates and their contributions to the long-term sequestration of soil organic matter and carbon. So I imagine she could probably also talk about Mark Watney and the Martian. But Morgan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you started this startup company, Deep Space Ecology, during your undergraduate work. I wonder if you could share with us the origination of the idea that you had and the passion that led into getting involved in this work and creating your own company to do this work.
Yeah, so Deep Space Ecology was actually founded based off of research that I had started in my undergrad at Duke University in North Carolina. And this research was pretty much a combination of my lifelong passions for the environment as well as space exploration. So you can say these were kind of childhood dreams of mine, where I was always told stories about both sides of my family, where my mom's side of the family was in the dairy and potato farming industries, and my dad's side of the family was in like the vegetable farming side. And so I've always just had this passion for the environment, going outside hiking, understanding how the ecological system works. And then with space exploration, just looking up at the stars and wondering if there is life out there, and if there are systems like we see here on Earth on other planets. And so when I was at Duke, I was trying to figure out how to combine these two passions together, because at that time, The Martian hadn't come out yet as a movie. There wasn't really much talk about agricultural systems in space beyond the experiments that were being done on the International Space Station. So I was kind of at a loss for how to combine these two together. And so I decided, with the help and influence of my father actually, to really dig into the research my second year at Duke to see if I could find that connecting point. And the connecting point that I found was closed ecological systems for space habitation, which that research was started in the Soviet Union in the 1960s with the BIOS experiments, But even before that, there was mentioning of closed ecological systems for space habitation in literature with Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Sorry if I say his last name incorrectly, but he was the father of space exploration and rocketry within the Soviet Union. And he was also a big literary figure. And actually in his book, Dreams of Earth and Sky, which he released, I believe, in the 1890s, he depicted and wrote about closed ecological systems in space. And so just seeing this connection, learning about closed ecological systems, I decided to really jump into this research in my undergrad. And at Duke, there's not really space research being done there. So a lot of it I had to do through independent studies where I cold called professors and asked them, hey, you're working on systems biology, or you're working on this element of environmental science. How would you like to put a space twist on it? And so that's how I was able to really dig into my research and develop a new model, a new system for closed ecological systems that I now term quasi-closed agroecological systems. And so there's some science and things that go into that, pretty much really bringing in those principles and theories of environmental science, landscape theory, agroecology, things like that. And so I was doing this research and I worked with a Mars regolith simulant. So I understand the cement element. As soon as you add water, you just have to really get at it. So I was doing this research and I actually went to the Humans for Mars Summit in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 2016. And at that summit, there wasn't really anyone talking about agriculture in space. If there was any mention of that, it was like, oh yeah, we'll grow plants on Mars. And that was it. And so at that time, there was really this open area, this niche that wasn't being filled. And so I decided to found Deep Space Ecology from that. And it's been a wild ride since that moment. And I've been able to continue my research while I was at Duke and then going into my PhD at Cornell University, working specifically on the soil science questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and doing a PhD can take a lot of time, and it's very occupying. But I'm glad you have deep space ecology, and you can contribute in this way. I checked out the website, love it. One thing I saw that I really appreciated a lot was this idea of an Earth epic, a Mars epic, and then a Europa epic. Kind of looking at this transition of how we understand closed system or quasi-closed agroecological systems through space and time. Considering first the issues that we do have here on our blue marble, and then kind of moving into how we take these further and further into space in our explorations. I'm wondering if you could just speak to that for a moment and how you personally see our current and future food needs on Earth and space kind of intertwining.
Yeah, so pretty much we really need to understand agriculture sustainability here on Earth to address the sustainable development and management of space agriculture, because we do not and should not repeat the same mistakes we have made with our agricultural systems here on Earth. You really just look at the history of agriculture and there's a lot of issues that have just been throughout the history of agriculture. So we have to understand how we can bring forward traditional ecological knowledge, which much of it is highly sustainable and was based on how ecological systems function. And much of that has been pushed to the wayside with, i.e., the coming of Europeans to the Americas, where they thought their system of agriculture was better, but really it was really unsustainable. So we have to look at systems like the Chinampa system in Mexico. We have to look at the Nabatean civilization in the Negev hinterlands in the Middle East, where with that civilization, they were able to support, I believe, up to like 30,000 people in the middle of this huge desert. And because they were able to use best practices that they developed at that time to distribute their water, even with limited water resources. So we have to look at our history of agriculture and understand what works and what doesn't work, and how we can bring things forward thoughtfully and sustainably, and with respect to the people and cultures that this knowledge has come from. So we have to make sure of that. We also have to understand that there is a lot of area for collaboration in research and business between the agricultural industry and the space industry, because there are similar challenges in the realms of extreme environment exposure. There are people living in deserts. There are people living in the North Pole, science being done in the South Pole. So there's already people working with agriculture in extreme environments. Dubai, I mean, they have a lot of opportunities right now where they're looking at how they can have agricultural systems in their extreme environments. So extreme environment exposure, human needs. Humans are part of ecological systems, and it's not, we need to make sure that we always put humans in the ecological context. We're not separate from it. We interact with it and the environment interacts with us. And so there's this feedback system that happens. So we have to make sure that we are always thinking about that. And then of course, food security and the dimensions of food security. If you look at, I believe it's the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, which is this annual report that is released by the United Nations and their organizations such as the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And in there, they have a definition for food security. And they have, I believe, what was it? 4 dimensions of food security, which are, you have to make sure that you have availability for your food. Make sure that food is available and that people can actually have access to it. Access being another dimension of food security, and that with access, it's not only physical access, but economic access as well, and having sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that people can actually use and understand how they can utilize their food sources, as well as utilize their local food sources as well. So when we're talking about space agriculture, you're gonna have very much limited food access. So you have to understand how you can create a system that is sustainable, resilient, that can provide for the food needs of your crew, especially if it's a multinational crew. Everyone's going to be coming from a different food background, a different food culture. There are going to be people with food allergies and food restrictions. So how can you create an agroecological system that meets those things? And then of course, the last dimension of food security is stability. Actually having a system that can be long-lasting, sustainable, that can make it through different events that may try to destabilize it. Here on Earth, it could be political related, economic related, pandemic related. And I mean, we're seeing that in a lot of inner cities where the food security issues are coming into foreplay with the pandemic because food is not getting where it needs to go. There's not grocery stores in certain areas, things like that. So there's, and of course, like another thing is just the soil and agricultural management that have similarities between Earth and space, where you have to make sure, like I said before, you have sustainable management, and we really need to bring sustainability into the conversation for the space industry, which is,
I'm going to cut you off just for a moment, if I may. It does seem super crucial to think about sustainability. If you don't mind, Morgan, I actually want to jump over to Michael Selden real quick just to have some time with him, and then we'll come back around to everyone again. And for those watching, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions for any of our panelists. Because sustainability is so crucial, and I love, Morgan, that you kind of framed the issue that we do need to see ourselves as part of an ecological system. And in some ways, I think we forget sometimes our own impact on our planet, on agricultural systems, on the organisms we share this biosphere with. So our next panelist is Michael Selden. Mike's background is in biochemistry and molecular biology. That's played a big role for him in dedicating his life to climate justice and science advocacy. His research has spanned fields from solving food crises in Africa to marine conservation in Southeast Asia. He's worked for New Harvest and was also the editor-in-chief of the Chinese news website, China Smack. But Mike is currently the CEO of Finless Foods. So Finless Foods is a company with a mission to bring sustainable, delicious seafood to the world without having to farm or harvest live fish from our beautiful oceans here. So Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great having you here. I'm really intrigued by this. I love the idea of lab-grown meats for the future, and I didn't even know lab-grown fish was in the works. As much as I love seafood, I do feel guilty about issues with bycatch and with overfishing and what it's done to our planet. So I wonder if you can tell us kind of like the vision that you have for where Finless Foods is going to go, and also will I be buying your fish in the near future?
Yeah, definitely. So, like in terms of the vision of like where we're headed, the company was basically formed to create sustainable food. But the idea here is to create food that is at its core sustainable and ethical, but that sells itself on market metrics. Because there's already a lot of sustainable and ethical food out there. It's just people aren't that into it. People really like seafood and they want to continue eating it. And so what we've done is we've assembled a team of cellular and molecular biologists that are making what is on the cellular level the same thing that people are eating today as sashimi. We're basically just taking the exact process that happens inside of a fish and making it happen outside of a fish. So you can still get the sashimi that tastes, cooks, looks exactly the way you're looking for it to, but it doesn't have any mercury, no plastic, we don't use antibiotics, and it doesn't destroy the ocean to create it. Every year we fish the ocean clean of pretty much everything, but our focus is really on tuna internally at Finless, although we've expanded out to other species recently. And basically we can't get any more tuna out of the ocean than we already do. And so the idea here is to be able to feed this growing need for protein. A lot of people are looking to move into healthier choices like seafood without completely devastating the ocean and hopefully even giving it the chance to recover a bit. So I always like this conference. I was here last year too and was on a panel because I know so little about space. So I'm learning a lot from all the other panelists as well. And actually, Sian said it earlier, which is that solutions that work for environmental protection are also really essential for colonizing space, because they're basically both dealing with an extremely hostile environment. Well, Mars is an extremely hostile environment, and we're basically terraforming it. Mars is and I'm going to butcher this, so scientists, please just absolutely make fun of me for this, but it's Mars is what happens if climate change really continues on the course that it's going for. It's just completely devastated and very difficult to even have an idea to support human life. So solutions can definitely be intermeshed between the two. So, when we started the company, we definitely did not have space in mind when we were doing this, but it applies really well. So, a lot of you all were talking about astronauts wanting other things to eat. What's it called? Something fatigue? I know someone just said it, but I'm blanking.
Menu fatigue.
Anyway, what's it called? Sorry?
Menu fatigue.
Menu fatigue, thank you. So yeah, menu fatigue. And Rafael talked a bit about being able to grow plants on Mars and how that's difficult, but very much possible. You're not going to breed animals in space. I can say that, I think, full stop. And you're definitely not going to breed tuna in space. We can't even figure out how to breed tuna on Earth. Right now, there aren't tuna farms. There are tuna ranches, which is you capture young tuna, bring them in and fatten them up. But closed life cycle tuna aquaculture right now is not economically viable at scale. So if we can't even do it on Earth, I don't know how we would possibly manage to, grab these massive creatures. Each tuna is 6 feet long. They're enormous. And somehow get them into space surviving. They need to be in water to breathe. So that means you need all that water surrounding them, and then you need them to breed. And you need big tanks filled with more water. It's just not viable. At Finless, what we can do is send up just a sample of cells, a small vial, and feed those cells plants. So we do need to solve the being able to grow plants in space issue, or else we're just transporting meat into space, which already is done today. It's just dehydrated. And from there, we could actually create a renewable meat supply in space. Our cells do need certain things to grow, right? It's not magic, so you do need inputs. But basically, the inputs that we are using are all salts, sugars, amino acids, and fermented proteins. So these are things that I do believe are at least theoretically possible to grow in space, even if not all of them are done at scale today. So yeah, basically, like, we see this as a solution for environmental issues on Earth, and hopefully something that can help us preserve the ocean for tomorrow, but also something that can really help humanity expand beyond its bounds and move into space as well.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, in my mind, I just kind of envisioned the Starship Enterprise coming down with its transparent aluminum siding and grabbing a bunch of tuna and taking them to space. And you're right, we're not there. But I love this idea of just taking a starter culture of fish cells to space. So, Mars is a limited resource environment. How do you foresee it? What are the biggest challenges you see if we want to, grow sustainably a large amount of, this fish product on Mars, especially in a lower gravity environment, and one where we have astronauts, perhaps even having to wear spacesuits to go back and forth and stuff like that.
Yeah, so this is again going to move into an area of expertise I don't 100% have, but actually we recently did grow fish in space. We're the first cell-based seafood company. There are others now as well. We're the first one to do anything in space. We last year had some fish printed aboard the ISS. It didn't get like tons of press in the US, but that is because we went up with the Russians. We went up with this really awesome company, and I'm just making sure that I have the name right so that I don't say it wrong. 3D Bioprinting Solutions. They're awesome to work with. And basically, like, on the Russian side of the ISS, they have this really cool bioprinter, which allows you to print tissue. And it's doing mostly medical applications right now, but this company, 3D Bioprinting, like, they reached out to us because they're like, hey, this could also be useful for food. And so we did print some fish microtissue in space. And the experiment, I would consider to be a success. We had like a long series of experiments that were going to happen in case they all worked. But I mean, I think a lot of the people here are scientists. That never happens. You never actually have a successful series of experiments. You have to go back, redesign, retry. So of course they didn't all work, but we got much further than we expected. And I'm really, really pleased with the results. And one of the messages that I'd like to bring here to like inject into the conversation is, like, on the Russian side of the ISS, they have this really cool and unique bioprinter, which allows us to print tissue, but they don't have a proliferation bioreactor. That would allow cells to actually expand into more cells, although they would stay disorganized. The American side of the ISS has a proliferation bioreactor where cells can grow out into more cells, but they don't have a bioprinter that can organize it into tissue. So basically what I'm saying is, I think we should probably be collaborating a little bit more. And I think that it would really be great for science and for space exploration.
It's awesome. Yeah, definitely. I did go to your website. I love it. I watched an awesome video you had there. And in the video, it showed several people eating the fish, which I know now because, the audience is probably going to ask this question. I'm sure you get this all the time. Can you tell us, like, what is the texture and the flavor like of your fish compared to, a bluefin tuna?
Yeah, so it's, on a cellular level, what we're making is bluefin tuna. And so the idea is to make something that has really no difference. The difference is that I can say, there's obviously no mercury, no plastic, but you can't taste that kind of thing. One of the big differences will be in freshness. Like, especially in the US, over 90% of the seafood that we eat is imported. Even the stuff that we grow ourselves, we still actually ship it mostly to China for processing, and then it gets shipped back. That's why the first time I ever had seafood outside of America, I was like, this is amazing, what's going on? I realized it was the first time I'd really ever had fresh fish. We just don't have it. And so what we can do is actually create a locally produced supply of extremely fresh seafood. So it'll be a different game in terms of freshness, basically. It was really interesting. Like, the first time that we ever ate some of it out of a bioreactor, it actually tasted like nothing. And we kind of freaked out because we thought we had screwed something up. But basically, if you look at the way that sushi chefs deal with fish, you have to let it interact with oxygen for a bit. This actually might be relevant for space. But basically, you do have to let it touch air for a few minutes for it to actually get that taste. And if you just straight up cut raw fish meat out of a fish, it's going to taste like pretty much nothing. So, what we make has extremely low levels of bacteria, which does mean that it can last longer in transit. We can produce it locally, which means it gets to people fresher. It just means maybe you have to interact with it a little bit differently. Maybe you have to leave it in your fridge for a little bit longer than you would otherwise. But basically, we're giving people like the freshest experience they could possibly ever have.
That's incredible. I definitely look forward to trying it. I'm kind of excited for it now. My mouth actually started watering when you mentioned the sashimi side of it. So I do want to go to our Q&A now. I just noticed we actually have a lot of questions for all four of you. If everyone's okay with it, I'd love to start with Rafael. He actually has to leave here in just a moment. Rafael, the first question for you comes from Caroline Chang. Caroline says, space farming, astrobotany, will be important for the future. Do you have any thoughts about the best legumes to grow on Mars in the future? Chickpeas, glycine max, etc.
But in terms of baking bread on Mars, I think it's something that's going to take a
Okay,
while.
we're not there yet.
No.
Another question from Joanna Kuzma. Why soil cultivation? Why use the regolith? Isn't it better to try soilless culturing like hydroponics?
Actually, we are investigating the applicability. I mean, the just comparison in terms of what costs more and what will be more effective or not in terms of time management for the colonists to maybe take part of their time to evaluate that. I think that at this point, in terms of overall aspects of both using regolith and using hydroponics, I think that regolith wins over hydroponics due to costs, and also due to the fact that hydroponics, once the entire system is contaminated, there is no way for you to contain it and you lose everything. So I think that completely closed systems is a problem right now. I don't doubt that we're going to find an alternative to that, but at the moment, I'm going 100% with using regolith.
One more question then, if we can, before you have to run. Stephen Lanton wants to know what sorts of non-governmental agencies have been supporting astrobotany in related fields.
Non-governmental agencies, I haven't reached out to them yet. I think that people are very skeptical to the fact that you could ask for funding to grow something. I think that what you can do is start with the space pitch and then transfer that space pitch to the applicability of the tech that you're developing for Earth applications. Some of the projects that we have developed, for instance, a model based on artificial intelligence that would kind of tell you what the ideal crop would be for a certain location, either on the lunar environment or Martian environment. We start with that pitch, and then we transfer that to, hey, you can do this on Earth. And some companies were interested on kind of jumping into that. So I think that unfortunately, for some people, this is still a little bit too far-fetched, but we have to continue to revel ourselves in and say, hey, this is our future here, and we need to figure this out. And but the welcoming factor for federal agencies, such as NASA, all work that we do is funded by NASA, so there's plenty of money there if you want to work with it. Not necessarily associated with the private sector, but with federal institutions are very welcoming to work with that.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Rafael. We really appreciate you being here. I know you have to run now for some professor requirements, so thank you.
Unfortunately, I would love to say. Just wanted to thank you all for having me, and thank you for your questions. If you guys have any more questions, just go to the Blue Marble Space website, or go to the Winston-Salem University website. My information is there. Feel free to email me. I love to talk about all of this, and just feel free to contact me at any time.
Awesome. Thanks, Rafael.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have fun.
All right, let's jump to some other questions. We have a lot of them here, guys. Sian, there's a bunch for you. So starting off, Richard Hertz wants to know, in your opinion, what kind of specific biosafety measures should we have on Mars to protect our food from contamination, and also to protect the Martian environment from contamination with our own food production and waste?
Well, that's one of the things, that's a really good question. And right now, there aren't any. But the idea is, how do you create a closed system where everything, for the most part, gets reused or managed somehow? And I think Morgan was mentioning this to some extent, is that we have to figure out how to best manage every resource to its fullest extent and reduce waste as much as possible, so that we don't have contamination and we're not digging, pits of food, waste at all. And so I think that that's one of the interesting challenges, is the level of efficiency we can get, because you look at the ISS and we're talking about the trash and the amount of packaging that still goes up, especially when it comes to food and how we package each little food or thing individually and then heat it up and all of that. And so we've got to figure out ways to manage all that and reuse everything as much as possible.
Absolutely, yeah. Another question for you, Sian. Ethan Atwell wants to know if your experiences in Martian simulations involved any kind of composting or food waste recycling.
No, it didn't. And that was one of the things, again, where we were just looking with our shelf-stable ingredients. We tried to eat everything that we created. And so we had a refrigerator and stuff. But this is one of the things that when we talk about food waste, we talk a lot about generating food, but we don't talk about food preservation too. And so how are we going to grow food? And a lot of times you can't eat it before it goes bad. And so you've got to figure out also how to preserve it and store it so that it doesn't get wasted. And so that's part of the whole cycle of things. And so, and we're still working on it. And that's why analogs are a lot of fun, because you can go in and you can specifically look at waste and the amount of waste generated and how to manage that better. But I have not been on a study that does that yet.
So it might come in the future. We'll see. I mean, we have a lot more simulation bases now. There's a lot more Mars analogs out there and a lot more work to do.
All over the place.
Yeah, it's getting cooler and cooler. DMARS and MDRS and FMARS and high seas and all these new habitats going up everywhere. And so it's pretty cool. James Hirschberg wants to know, what about spicy food and spices for Mars?
Oh, yeah.
Considering how spicy cuisine might impact our psychology, our physiology.
Well, that's one of the things when we're talking about variety of food, and you can imagine being able to grow a few things really well and having a very limited space pantry, but having a wide range of spices so that you can make, a simple dish taste different because of the amount of spices or the heat. The International Space Station is well known for hot sauce and wanting that spicy food. And I imagine that's going to continue onto the moon and Mars. But a sophisticated pantry of spices is something that is going to be really important. I don't know how our other panelists feel about that, but again, it's about taking that and being able to create variety with the limited resources we have.
Absolutely. And Morgan and Michael, feel free to chime in if you do have answers as well to these questions. For instance, here's another one from Jeff, who wants to know if there's any menu considerations given to plants that lower stress but might not be like a staple crop. Things like skullcap, chamomile, lavender, lemon balm, to add maybe flavor, tea, that kind of stuff.
Well, I'm drinking my tea right now, and so this is a peppermint. I think that these are things that we've got to be able to consider, especially if we can use everything that we grow. We want it to have a purpose, and so part of that is just mental health and wellness. And teas, coffees. One of the things on my Space Snacks show is, what would you want to drink on the moon or Mars, right? And so thinking about coffee versus teas versus even alcohol in space, right, Chris? So all of these things we need to consider.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If I go to Mars, I want some scotch, just a little bit to go along with me of some very nice.
I'm sure we're going to ferment something, right, Morgan?
Definitely. And just to add on a little bit to what you were saying, especially when it comes to the multifunctionality of plants, you're not only bringing plants up there for food, like you said, you also have the teas that can help with the stress and the emotional, mental element of things. So you have to think about the multifunctionality of plants and think of it just go beyond food. And this is getting into this theory of ecological services, thinking about all of the services that your plants, your ecological system can provide to you. So you can use this plant for food, but maybe it also has a medicinal purpose as well, or it can be used for building materials or for cooking oil. So we have to think about how these different plants can actually provide different functions for us as well.
Definitely. So here's another question. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Last year at this conference, I remember there was a talk, I think it was like Ardbeg, the Scotch company. They had sent up some Ardbeg and aged it with some Ardbeg like oak chips on, I don't know if it was
That's
the
correct.
it was
Yeah, they sent that. Yeah, they sent that up in 2011. Came down in 2015. They're not the only ones. Also, Suntory, the Japanese whiskey producer, has also actually currently has a whiskey aging experiment up on ISS.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's very
Made or not. And I'm hoping that we will not have to make that, and we can accommodate everybody and their, you know, like we were saying, their allergies, and whether you're vegetarian or vegan, or how are we going to be able to make space for everyone. But the thing about it is that should some of those things, and the debate about should we be eating some of these things really comes into play too. So I think that that's where technology can help us, and what Michael's doing can help us with that idea of meat in space.
Yeah, hopefully we can diversify people's menu up there, and you know, technology like what we do at Finless, like cellular agriculture, can help. Because otherwise, you know, I think it might be wisest to send up people who don't really care. Like we can just do some sort of like Willy Wonka golden ticket program, but for Soylent. So, you know, every 1 millionth Soylent customer gets sent up there because apparently they don't care.
That is so true, right? And then that would be really interesting. And I can see analogs playing in the role of this, because you can literally lock people up in a Mars simulation and just have them have Soylent for 4 months and see whether or not there are any issues.
Yeah, just to see what happens, right? We have another question from Ethan Atwell for Morgan here, but again, Mike and Cyan, feel free to jump in. What considerations are being given to waste, recycling, and composting in these kinds of systems, in these environments in the future?
That's a very great question. And this is something that I've been really much looking into, and something that I've started to call ecological service reservoirs. How do you create these reservoirs of nutrients, of your waste that can be reused, so that you can pull from them whenever your system needs a little bit more nitrogen, a little bit more carbon, things like that. So we definitely, when we're looking at quasi-closed or closed ecological systems, we have to think about how we can reduce that waste, because we're also talking about long-term, sustainable, adaptable systems, where you don't want a system to constantly need to rely on a supply chain, which can be politically and economically charged. And we see the issues with that here on Earth, where there's a lot of isolated communities, especially in food insecure areas, that are reliant on these expensive supply chains. And it really doesn't work for the community. So you have to think about how you can use those, recycling and using compost, vermicompost, other different kinds of things to reduce your supply chain needs, make yourself more adaptable in your situation. And adaptability is something I think we need to talk about more as well for space agriculture. Is here on Earth, we have our ecological system here that allows us to adapt when we have a pandemic, when we have a pest go through an agricultural field and kill off like 50%, or climate change, we can pull from other places. And climate change, I believe, is like one of the major issues when it comes to a threat towards our agricultural system here on Earth. So having those reservoirs where, whether it's compost, whether it's gas collection or things like that, that you can draw from, I think will allow you to increase your adaptability and sustainability.
Absolutely. And on that, so this next question is a bit of an ethical question, just to give you a warning. So let's look forward to the future. Humans are on Mars. We have systems where we're growing plants, We're growing finless foods, fish on Mars. Humans are now living. Will we have to compost dead human bodies to return those nutrients back into the cycle on Mars? And like I said, it's a doozy.
Yeah, I can't really say anything to that. I know that especially in I don't know what you would call it. There are people who are now having their bodies cremated and then put into pots with trees, and they have a tree grow from their burial site. So there is things like that happening here on Earth. I can't say for sure how we will approach this on other planets, especially since I want to make sure I don't say anything that could offend people, especially since I'm not a full expert on this particular topic area. So we definitely are seeing the use of cremated bodies to add something beautiful, add something natural to our environments here on Earth. So maybe we might see something like that. But there are definitely, to get a little bit more technical, we also have to consider what people are putting into their bodies as well. There are people who are going to have like medication that they've been taking all their lives, different kinds of contamination, things like that. So we also have to consider, what are we putting back into the soil when we bury our dead as well? So those are some things that I guess would help answer that question. I really don't know how we'll approach this, but it is definitely an important question of how do we respectfully bring our dead forward to their next stage of life.
Yeah, those ethical questions are really interesting, right? And
Yeah.
Sasha Sagan's recent work on finding ritual in our lives through her book for small creatures such as we, and it's made me think a lot about, on Mars, how will we create new rituals? How will we define our ethics in the scope of what we're doing? And so a question for all three of you that I've seen now, several people have asked basically the same question, and especially important for Mike. So should people have an ethical leaning towards veganism or vegetarianism, and leave meat behind ethically if they choose to go to space? And what are your thoughts on that?
I think if either in space we're going to be able to make meat or we're not. And I don't know if like people's choices on that are going to matter much, because it's like, I guess it depends on what people are trying to affect, right? Like some people think that red meat is unhealthy, and for those people, sure, like don't eat red meat. Some people believe that all meat is unhealthy, and so I guess they shouldn't either. But for now, the astronauts are just eating the food that gets sent up with them, is my understanding. And any sort of like continuous colony that's going on in space is going to be not like a market economy. Like it's going to be set up by scientists essentially to like make sure that everything's running as efficiently as possible. So I would say whoever's designing the mission should really set the menu, and then the people who are going up should just know what the menu is going to be like when they get there and deal with that as they're going up. It'd be great to be able to include everybody, I think, but I think the most efficient option is probably plants in the first place. That probably includes more or less everybody, except for people who do like the all meat diet. I guess they're screwed in this case. I don't know. I think it would be more prescriptive than people really choosing their dietary choices and making those choices in space.
Yeah, it's really important to consider how our diets might shift and change, but what we can do, to move forward with it, including, lab-based meats, lab-based fish. It's a really important thing to think about. And Michael, there's another question here for you. So when you printed this fish tissue in space, was it on the ISS done with manual operation by an astronaut, or was it more autonomous with a payload?
Was it more autonomous with the payload? So, being totally honest, I'm not 100% sure on the distinction. The bioprinter itself is operated by an astronaut, and I've got pictures of him operating it, so I know that much happened. And my understanding is you know, it's fairly similar to the type of bioprinter that you would see on Earth. So I mean, a lot of the process is automated. You don't have somebody like physically putting little pieces of tissue together or anything, but you do need to have the machine in general operated by a person.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, to see how this is going to, you know, function moving forward. If we'll ever have a fully autonomous system that could do it itself in low Earth orbit or on the moon or on Mars. Another question for you, Mike, but anyone can answer. This one comes from Artemis Westerberg. Hi, Artemis. And she asks, is sashimi manufactured based on nutritionism, meaning that it uses an incomplete idea of what is healthy and good in natural foods like veggies, fruits, etc.?
I've never heard that word before.
Okay, yeah, I actually have.
We do like a nutritional analysis to try and make sure that it contains all the proteins that people are most interested in. You know, meat in general, the flavor and nutrition is determined by the diet of the animal. It's determined by the plants that get pulled up through the like food web essentially. And so we're making sure that we have all those things present, you know. We're making sure that all the proteins people are looking for are there, all the like long chain fatty acids, omega-3, omega-6, DHA, EPA. And our fish right off the bat has no mercury, no plastic, no antibiotics. So I think that, you know, no matter what your definition of nutritious is or nutritionism is, I think that what we make has a very strong argument that it's healthier than what you'd be eating from the ocean or from a farm.
That's a good point. This is a question for, I think, all three of you from Luca White. Luca wants to know, do you think microalgae will be relevant as a source of protein as well? Would that be useful for us in space exploration? And maybe Morgan's the best to answer that first.
Sure. So with microalgae, I think the question, like the question that always comes up with that accompanying question is the taste. I've eaten microalgae before, and the texture can be odd, and the taste is odd as well. I mean, if you also have spices, maybe you could do something. So that again goes into people's willingness to eat microalgae. I think it could potentially be part of the entire agroecological system. But just eating microalgae, again, you're going to get into a situation of menu fatigue. Certain people are just not going to like it, no matter what you do.
I love that. I just noticed in the chat, Jeff said that spirulina is nasty and that we should compost the spirulina and grow something palatable.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I was just going to say the same thing. As long as you can make it taste like pizza, I'll be all over it. But again, it's that taste and texture and the things that really resonate with us when it comes to food and the culture around that. And as we live on Mars, actually have more people kind of coming at a younger age, and potentially even having people being born there, their food and palate taste will be very different than the first people we send there. But the first people we send there are people like you and me, and we come with this whole kind of baggage of what we like to eat and our perception of food and the culture around food. And we're just going to be taking that with us in the beginning, but it definitely will evolve to be Martian.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Sian, for you, you had mentioned this issue with us kind of losing our smell a little bit when we go to space, and so we add more spices to our food. We've had this issue with the shuttles and International Space Station. So Emily Harari asks, she says that she was reading about space scents. So will some space dishes be tested for their smell in microgravity or zero gravity? Maybe some of them are too stinky or not smelly enough. Since scent affects our taste, is there any research going on in that realm that you know of that using scent as well with our food?
Yeah, and I haven't been directly involved with any of that, but it's really important. And so this whole idea of what you cook and how you smell, living in an analog with other people, I could definitely see that. because there are times people would pop around the corner and be like, wait, something smells good. And then there are other times where you might have messed something up in the kitchen and people are like, you know, what are you cooking down there? It smells terrible. And so the whole idea of when you're in a closed environment, and we're not even, high seas isn't sealed, but a closed environment like the ISS, and even like the space shuttle when that went up, all of those smells stay there and circulate, and how that air moves. So you got to be really mindful of that. And I mean, I just know, I can imagine when you open that hatch to go on the ISS for the first time, woo, you can only imagine what that smells like.
Yeah, indeed. That's awesome. Here's another question from Bork. How do we ensure that no aphids and or pests and other crop diseases go with us into space and into Mars, and maybe even for our fish? I mean, there are things that affect meats and stuff as well. How do we ensure that we're keeping our food safe?
I can take a swing at this. So, I mean, like, there's a regulatory framework that we're looking to use for our industry. It's called HACCP, the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. And basically, it's sort of just you've bottlenecked the food system. At each one of its inputs, there's a point where you bottleneck it. So basically, like, if we're trying to make sure there's no like seafood-borne parasites entering the food supply, we make sure that we end up with like one tiny vial of cells, scan the crap out of it, basically, like test it for absolutely everything, make sure it doesn't have any of these things that we're worried about, and then toss away all the old stuff, go forward just with that in a perfectly sterile environment. That type of thing is very possible when you're putting food aboard a spaceborne craft. And so like using frameworks like that already exist today to keep our food supply safe in America can definitely be adapted. I'm sure it would be a little different, but can definitely be adapted as a framework to making sure food in space is safe as well.
Hmm.
And that is actually, when you're talking about the framework that is in place in the United States, was directly developed out of the space program for the Mercury and Gemini, because NASA did not want its astronauts getting sick in space.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. I did not know that. That's cool.
So here's another question from Gary Fisher, who wants to poll all three of you. And I'm going to alter this question a little bit, Gary. Gary wants to know what we should land on Mars first, human explorers, or something like a robotic greenhouse or a robotic laboratory for growing our fish. Should we send the means to make the food before we send the people who need the food?
I'm all for dropping the refrigerator out of the sky first. If you're going to send me, drop that first, and then I'll go, because I don't want to be, you know, Mark Watney starving to death if something goes wrong. So
yeah, you definitely want both, right? Like, you definitely want to make sure that there is a refrigerator there in case the planting of seeds doesn't work out. You know, like right now, there's a lot of work being done to automate food production on Earth. And so that stuff it's pretty close to being scaled up reality. And a lot of places really use very, very little human interaction. Like, for example, at Finless, like, our plan is to run bioreactors with extremely little human input, because it just adds an error, it like reduces sterility. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I got in this document is that, like, we're looking to do a mission to Mars by 2030. I think that stuff in terms of automating food production, at least on Earth, is kind of going to be reality more and more within the next like 2 years, you know? And so like, I think by 2030s, we definitely be ready to start automating that. That said, like Sian said, you should definitely put the refrigerator there. Holy crap. Like, we don't know what's going to happen. And so it's important to have backup plans.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I can add to this as well. I definitely agree with them as well. You want to have your agricultural system developing before you get there, because it takes a long time. And in this case, we're going to be going through what people theorize as ecological succession, which is how do you go from bare rock, bare sand to an ecological system. And so we're going to be needing to go through this process. And usually it takes hundreds of years for this to happen. So how do you expedite that as well? And here on Earth, we see this movement towards digital agriculture, which is something that Michael mentioned as well, is automating agriculture, having machines do a lot of the labor, and especially when humans can't be out there doing it. And so we see that happening. And then my research as well is looking into what my PhD research is looking into the soil aspect of this. How do you take a degraded starting material and revitalize it for agricultural use? And so 2 experiments that I'm currently working on, we have a soil microbiome experiment going up via Blue Origin New Shepard through the Ken Susan Memorial Spaceflight Award that I received in 2019. So we're sending a soil microbiome experiment with that one. And then we also have a planned proposed ISS experiment where we're going through the final negotiations for that, where again, it's another soil microbiome experiment that could potentially be on the International Space Station, where we're looking at that gravity question of how microorganisms interact with soil in a microgravity environment. What can that tell us about how organic matter and soil aggregates are held in a reduced gravity environment, which could inform us of how we can work with the regolith on Mars, as well as looking back here on Earth with how better understanding the fundamental mechanisms of how microorganisms are interacting with the soil. And that can feed into how we manage the soil if we understand what takes priority fundamentally on that scale. And thankfully, I have support from the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship that I received this year, as well as a fellowship with Norfolk Institute. So
awesome. Yeah, congrats.
Have my time funded for those.
It's a really nice fellowship to have for grad school.
Yeah.
So congrats on that. We are going to start wrapping up now. I want to say a huge thanks to all 3 of you, as well as Rafael, for joining us today. Thanks to everyone watching. There are a lot more questions here that we just didn't get to. So for anyone who's watching and had a question that I didn't have a chance to ask of our panelists, please reach out to them online. You can find Morgan online very easily in Deep Space Ecology. Michael Selden you can find online from Finless Foods. Dr. Sian Proctor is all over the internet. She's a star. And definitely watch Space Snacks. Lots of cool stuff going on there. And so thank you all for watching. I'm going to hand it back right now to Chris Carberry. So thank you all for tuning in. And I've been Graham now. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Sian, Mike, Morgan, and Rafael. Terrific panel, one of my favorite topics. So always love hearing about that and all the options we have for growing food and producing food and all the implications around that. Just a couple final announcements. As I mentioned earlier on, I hope you'll join us next week on Thursday, June 25th at 1 p.m. We're having a special Designing Mars session. That'll be moderated by Beth Munn from Casual Space. That'll have Michael Zizo, an architect, as well as Vera Miliani from Mars City Design, as well as probably a couple other panelists we'll be announcing soon. I also want to mention, a number of people were mentioning, I believe in chat, the Humans to Mars Summit. We haven't announced it yet, but we will be announcing details next week. We are going all virtual for the Humans to Mars Summit. And so we will announce that it'll be on August 31st through September 3rd. So we'll be stretching it out over 4 days. And so details of registration and programming will be announced next week. So thank you once again, everybody, for coming. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.